a quiet corner of the hidden leaf village, where the leaves rustled like murmured secrets and time seemed to flow just a little more slowly, a boy named Orochimaru was born beneath a silent sky. From the moment he first opened his eyes, there was something distant in his gaze, something searching. He was not like the others. While other children laughed and played and chased each other beneath the trees, Orochimaru sat still, watching the patterns of clouds as if trying to decipher the hidden order behind their drifting dance. He spoke little, smiled rarely, and listened always. Even as a child, his silence did not come from shyness. It came from attention. He was listening not to others, but to the deeper hum of the world, the secret pulse of life that most overlooked. And even then, he seemed to understand what others couldn't, that life, in all its beauty, was also unbearably fragile. He would visit the small graves outside the village, drawn not by grief, but by curiosity. He would ask questions no one else would. Why do we die? What happens to our souls? Is death truly an end, or merely another form of transformation? These weren't morbid thoughts for him. They were sincere, gentle ponderings of a mind that refused to accept the finality of decay. When his parents died, taken by war or illness, it didn't matter which. It did not break him. It intrigued him. The pain was real, yes, but even deeper was the sense that something had slipped from the world without explanation. Orochimaru began to hunger for that explanation, and from that hunger, a path began to unfold. Under the guidance of Hiruzen Sarutobi, the third Hokage, Orochimaru flourished like a shadow blooming beneath the light. Hiruzen saw in him a kind of genius that only appears once in a generation. The boy absorbed knowledge as if he had lived lifetimes before. Jutsu, philosophy, history, biology. There was no subject he did not devour. Alongside the brash and reckless Jiraiya and the fierce, determined Tsunade, Orochimaru completed the legendary trio who would go on to be known as the Sannin. But while the others formed bonds and bickered and trained together like siblings, Orochimaru always stood a little apart, not out of pride, but because he was already drifting away, his mind walking paths the others hadn't noticed yet. He was fascinated by the nature of chakra, by the structure of cells, by the idea that a body could be something more than a vessel for the soul, that it could be a tool, a gateway, a canvas. And yet, at the same time, he performed his duties for the village with unflinching precision. On the battlefield, he was cold and efficient, his snake-like techniques terrifying enemies and allies alike. But behind every mission, beneath every smile he gave to Hiruzen, there was always that quiet whisper. What if we didn't have to die? What if life could be rewritten? As the wars raged and bodies fell, Orochimaru did not weep. He recorded. He studied. He began to notice patterns in bloodlines, in abilities, in the way chakra manifested differently in each person. The world was a puzzle, and people were its pieces. And so he asked himself, what if I took them apart? What if I found out how they fit? This idea, once only a faint ripple in the stillness of his mind, began to grow. He started conducting secret experiments, just small things at first. Tests, hypotheses, harmless samples. But the questions would not stop. He was not content with understanding life. He wanted to control it. When the war ended and peace settled uneasily over the world again, Orochimaru did not rest. He went deeper into his work, now more secret than ever. He gathered data, bodies, scrolls, anything that could lead him closer to the truth. He developed techniques that made even seasoned shinobi shiver. And still, he smiled softly, politely, keeping up the appearance of a loyal Konoha shinobi. But in the deepest rooms of his labs, he was already becoming something else. Something unbound. He was peeling away the layers of humanity, like old skin, reaching for something eternal beneath. Eventually, the truth began to leak. Whispers turned to rumors, and rumors turned to accusations. When Hiruzen finally confronted his former student, it was not a battle of power, but of sorrow. The old man still loved Orochimaru in some distant, painful way. But what he saw now was no longer a boy with questions. It was a man who had replaced morality with methodology. The laboratories were found. The corpses were discovered. Orochimaru did not deny any of it. He only looked at his teacher with calm, golden eyes and asked, "Why is it wrong to seek the truth?" When he fled the village, he did not run like a criminal. He walked like a man finally free of constraints. Konoha had become too small for him, too afraid. He would not be limited by laws or taboos or emotions. He would pursue knowledge beyond the horizon, beyond morality, beyond even the concept of identity. He shed his name like a skin and slithered into the shadows of the world. In time, he would align himself with darkness, not because he craved destruction, but because the dark offered him freedom. The criminal underworld, the rogue organizations, the outlawed knowledge, these became his new home. He founded hidden laboratories in desolate places. He recruited followers not with promises of power, but with glimpses of the forbidden. He became a symbol of something terrifying. A man who would sacrifice anything, anyone, even himself, to achieve his dream. And yet, in the solitude of his sanctuaries, Orochimaru often returned to silence. He still watched the clouds. He still asked questions. But now, his voice echoed in empty rooms, and his hands were stained with the cost of his curiosity. Still, he believed. He believed that if he just kept digging, kept peeling back the layers of existence, he would find it. That single, shining answer hidden at the core of all things, the key to eternity. And so he continued, slipping further away from what he had been, and deeper into what he was becoming. Not a man, not a shinobi, not a villain, but a question sharpened into the shape of a serpent, slithering through the world in search of an answer that might never come, far beyond the borders of Konoha, where the wind whispered over empty plains and the stars blinked above forgotten ruins. Orochimaru continued his quiet metamorphosis. He was no longer bound by village loyalties or childhood ties. His mind, unchained from the constraints of morality, stretched into places others feared to glance. He had slipped into the crevices between nations, making himself a ghost in the world's memory, visible only when he chose to be. The man who had once walked the streets of the Hidden Leaf had become something stranger, something deeper. He established hideouts, like a spider spinning webs in the dark, each one a nest of experiments and secrets. He no longer worked in the name of any cause but his own. Nations rose and fell, alliances shifted, but Orochimaru remained still in his pursuit, like a cold river cutting endlessly through stone. He gathered orphans and misfits, shinobi who had been cast aside or crushed by war, and he offered them a choice. Not redemption, not comfort, only purpose. He taught them that the world's rules were illusions, that strength came not from tradition, but from evolution. And one by one, they followed him, not out of loyalty, but out of the terrifying allure of his vision. It was during this time that he met Kabuto, a boy with eyes full of questions and a mind too sharp for peace. Orochimaru saw in him a reflection of his younger self, a curiosity that burned quietly, waiting to be given fuel. Under Orochimaru's guidance, Kabuto became more than an apprentice. He became a mirror, a student, a future. He absorbed Orochimaru's teachings, not with reverence, but with hunger. And in time, he became indispensable. But even then, Orochimaru never saw him as an equal, only as a vessel for ideas, a page on which to write the next chapter of his philosophy. With Kabuto at his side, and his research advancing in quiet, terrible strides, Orochimaru turned his gaze once again toward Konoha, not with hatred, but with fascination. The village was not merely his past. It was a wellspring of bloodlines, of secrets, of potential. And among those secrets, one name glimmered like a jewel in his thoughts: Uchiha. The Sharingan, with its twisting, endless depths, represented to him the perfect intersection of power and transformation. To understand it would be to unravel something fundamental about chakra, about perception, about control. It became his next obsession. He infiltrated the village through whispers and shadows, setting traps not with wires, but with words. He sought to study the Uchiha clan from the inside, but he found the doors shut to him. And so, ever patient, he turned to the next best thing. Itachi, the prodigy of the clan, the quiet boy with eyes too old for his age. Orochimaru watched from afar, calculating, testing, waiting for a moment of weakness. But there was none. Itachi saw through him, not just through his actions, but through his intentions. When Orochimaru tried to take his body, to claim the Sharingan as his own, Itachi did not hesitate. In a moment that felt like a lifetime, he turned Orochimaru's own technique against him, severing his connection and casting him out like a shadow from a dream. Defeated, Orochimaru withdrew. He did not rage. He did not curse. He simply recalibrated. The Uchiha could wait. There were other paths to power. And in the wake of this failure, another opportunity emerged. The Hidden Sound Village. He would build a new sanctuary, not hidden in the margins of the world, but bold and undeniable. A village, not of history, but of design. Hidden Sound was never meant to be a real village. It was a laboratory wrapped in the illusion of a nation, a testing ground for the next stage of evolution. And it was there that Orochimaru found his next vessel, a boy named Kimimaro. Kimimaro was different. He did not question. He did not resist. He followed Orochimaru with a purity that bordered on worship. His bloodline, the Shikotsumyaku, the dance of bone, was rare, beautiful, terrifying. Orochimaru marveled at it, not with affection, but with scientific awe. He planned to use Kimimaro's body, to make it his own, to slip into it like a new skin, and continue his quest from a stronger foundation. But fate intervened. Kimimaro grew sick. His body, so perfect, began to fail. Orochimaru, in his own cold way, mourned, not for the boy, but for the lost potential, the lost path. And still, he pressed forward. Time was running short. His own body was rejecting him, decaying from the inside out like a shell left too long in the sun. He had pushed it too far, performed too many forbidden experiments, stretched too far from nature. He needed a new vessel, and quickly. That's when he turned his eyes toward Sasuke, young, angry, isolated. Sasuke was everything Orochimaru needed, a body of Uchiha blood, a mind bent by vengeance, and a soul dangling over the edge of corruption. Orochimaru did not seduce Sasuke with lies. He offered him power, plain and raw. He gave him the tools, the temptation, and the time. And Sasuke, blinded by his thirst for revenge against Itachi, accepted. He walked away from the leaf and into Orochimaru's waiting arms like a moth toward flame. Orochimaru, for once, felt close to triumph. He trained Sasuke with a kind of careful cruelty. He fed him jutsu like poison berries, pushing him harder and harder, knowing the boy would survive because he had to. Every spar, every lesson, every manipulation was another step toward possession. Orochimaru was patient. He watched Sasuke grow stronger, faster, sharper, and all the while he waited for the perfect moment to strike, to make Sasuke his new vessel and escape the prison of his dying flesh. But again, his ambition outpaced his reach. Sasuke, like Itachi before him, saw through the illusion. He was not a puppet, not a tool. He turned on Orochimaru before the transfer could be completed. He cut him down without hesitation, not out of anger, but out of cold logic. Orochimaru, once more, was cast into shadow, a being of fragments and memories, sealed inside the very techniques he had invented. And yet, he did not die, because death, for Orochimaru, was never the end. Orochimaru drifted in silence, caught between life and death, mind and matter. In the shadow of Sasuke's rebellion, his essence lingered like smoke in a sealed jar, scattered within cursed seals, within fragments of chakra hidden in dark corners of the world. And from that fog of near oblivion, he watched. Time moved differently for him now. He was no longer a man bound by flesh or ambition. He was thought and will, waiting patiently for the world to open a door he could pass through. And as it always did, the world eventually obliged. Kabuto, ever the faithful reflection, began to change in Orochimaru's absence. The apprentice who once studied from the shadows began to believe himself the master. Alone and unanchored, Kabuto infused himself with remnants of Orochimaru's genetic legacy, attempting to become more than a man, something perfect, something complete. And in doing so, he pulled Orochimaru's essence further into himself. The teacher had once warned against losing oneself to the power one wielded. But Kabuto, like many before him, mistook absorption for evolution. As he grew stronger, Orochimaru's will stirred once again, like a whisper in a storm. He was not gone. He had simply changed shape. But even before that reawakening, a small piece of Orochimaru remained within Sasuke, a sliver of chakra tucked away in the cursed seal, pulsing quietly, like an ember waiting for breath. And when Sasuke stood at the threshold of a new war, seeking answers only the dead could provide, he turned back to the man he had once destroyed, using forbidden techniques and fragments of Orochimaru's power. Sasuke summoned him back into the world, not as a tyrant, but as a guide. Orochimaru emerged from the ritual not in rage, but in strange stillness. His body was new, rebuilt from cells and remnants, and his mind, though sharp as ever, was altered. There was no anger in him, no thirst for revenge. He looked at Sasuke not as a failed vessel, but as a completed lesson. The world had changed in his absence. The Akatsuki had fallen. Madara had returned. The shinobi alliance had formed. For the first time in his long life, Orochimaru felt like an observer rather than an architect. And in that stillness, something unusual stirred in him. Curiosity, not about jutsu or power, but about people. He accompanied Sasuke to meet the reanimated Hokage, each one a pillar of the village he had once turned his back on. He listened as Hashirama spoke of unity, as Tobirama recalled the Uchiha with weary distrust, as Hiruzen lamented the cost of his choices, and as Minato gazed toward a son he never got to raise. Orochimaru, who had once seen the village as a cage, now saw it as a garden. Flawed, perhaps, but alive in ways his old ambitions had blinded him to. And so, when Sasuke left to walk his own path, Orochimaru did not interfere. He watched. He learned. The war surged around him, a chaos of gods and monsters, and Orochimaru, once the cause of so much devastation, remained at its edge, still and quiet. There was no longer anything he needed to prove. He did not join the battle as a villain, nor as a hero. He moved like a shadow along the margins, observing the consequences of a world he had helped shape but no longer sought to control. He saw the rise of Naruto, the transformation of Sasuke, the fall of Madara, and the unraveling of Kaguya. He watched as the great conflict reached its crescendo, not with conquest, but with understanding. The boy he had once dismissed as loud and foolish had become the bridge between hatred and peace. And Orochimaru, perhaps for the first time in his life, felt no compulsion to interfere. He had tried to remake the world in his image, only to realize the world did not need another image. It needed time. Time to learn, to heal, to grow. After the war, Orochimaru did not vanish. He simply drifted. No longer hunted, no longer feared, he became a quiet enigma, a presence tolerated rather than pursued. The new world had no place for the villain he had once been, but it also had no way to erase the legacy he had left behind. He returned to his hideouts, now more like sanctuaries than laboratories, and continued his work, not to conquer, but to understand. His relationship with his former apprentices changed. Kabuto, broken and humbled, sought redemption and found it in caring for orphaned children. Sasuke, still carrying the weight of his choices, left his revenge behind and became a wandering protector. Even Yamato, who once spied on Orochimaru, now stood guard over him like a silent agreement between predator and prey, an acknowledgement that the man before him was no longer the threat he used to be. And in all of this, Orochimaru's mind remained ever in motion. He studied the evolution of chakra, the mutation of bloodlines, the relationship between memory and identity. He raised Mitsuki, a synthetic being born from his experiments, but raised with something strange and new: hope. Orochimaru did not tell Mitsuki what to become. He did not mold him into a weapon or a vessel. He simply gave him the choice he had always denied himself: to walk into the world with curiosity not hunger. In this, perhaps, Orochimaru found something like peace, not the kind found in silence or stillness, but in observation, in letting the world move without trying to hold it still. He had lived lifetimes in one. He had worn many faces, spoken many truths, and shed many skins. And though he remained unchanged in body, still pale, still serpentine, still strange, his soul had learned to rest. Because in the end, Orochimaru was never just a villain, never just a scientist, or a sage, or a seeker. He was a question that never stopped echoing. What lies beyond what we are allowed to know? And though he never fully answered it, he came to understand that sometimes the asking was enough. Orochimaru's name had once summoned dread. Mothers whispered it to disobedient children. Shinobi flinched when hearing rumors of his sightings, and villages fortified borders based on speculation that he might pass nearby. But time softened even the sharpest edges. The war ended. The world changed. And in this strange, tentative peace, Orochimaru no longer wore the face of war. He drifted instead in a haze of detached curiosity, not in hiding, but in deliberate withdrawal from the cycle he had once desperately tried to bend to his will. The man who had craved immortality, who had defied the gods of death, now lived not in conquest, but in quiet watching. His reappearance into the public eye was not marked by violence or fanfare, but by paperwork. An agreement struck with Konoha oversaw his freedom. Under supervision, he continued his research in a facility nestled in isolation. For some, it was unthinkable that such a man should walk freely, even in the margins. But others understood. They saw not a pardon, but a containment, a cold calculation that a dormant Orochimaru was safer than a hunted one. And Orochimaru himself? He accepted the terms, not because he had changed his beliefs, but because he no longer needed to resist. He no longer wanted destruction. He simply wanted to see what came next. Mitsuki was the future. Not in the abstract, philosophical sense, but in the literal. The child he had created, not as a vessel or a weapon, but as an inquiry. Mitsuki had been born from tubes and formula, but his purpose was not pre-written. Orochimaru gave him freedom, even encouraged him to leave, to seek the leaf, to walk among the children of heroes and villains, and decide for himself who he wished to be. There was no leash, no seal, no backup plan. It was perhaps the greatest departure from the old Orochimaru, the version who would have embedded a dozen fail-safes, controlled the boy's mind from the shadows, and called it protection. Instead, he watched from a distance, through reports, through conversations with Yamato, who had been assigned to observe him, through the rare visits Mitsuki made to check in. Orochimaru never asked him to return. He didn't interfere when Mitsuki grew attached to Boruto and Sarada, when he took dangerous missions, when he made mistakes. The curiosity was not in control anymore. It was in witnessing, truly witnessing, who the boy might become if given the freedom to choose. It was not a perfect relationship. Mitsuki often questioned his own identity, and Orochimaru had few comforting answers. But he never lied to him. That alone marked the depth of his change. The shinobi world, for its part, moved on with tentative steps. Boruto's generation knew Orochimaru's name, but only as history. They spoke of him like a myth, like a monster that had been locked in a storybook. And yet, he was real, always real, just beyond the horizon. He made no effort to re-enter politics or village life. He rarely appeared in public, but when he did, his presence was undeniable. Serpentine eyes scanning the crowd, words slithering from his tongue like ancient riddles, presence cold and calm like a still lake hiding unknown depths. He no longer craved power, but he had not abandoned it. He simply kept it folded away, waiting. Should he ever need to wield it again, he still researched. His lab had changed. No more bodies strung up like puppets, no more grotesque rituals in the name of transcendence. But the questions remained. Could a soul be copied? Could will survive death? Could identity be broken and remade like glass? He pondered these not in pursuit of dominance, but in pursuit of knowledge, stripped of ego. Even immortality no longer obsessed him. He had lived enough to understand that eternity was not a prize, but a mirror, one that showed you endlessly to yourself. And Orochimaru, after lifetimes of gazing inward, had made peace with the reflection. Old faces faded from his world. Jiraiya was gone, lost beneath the sea. Tsunade retired, her legacy fading like the last notes of a proud song. Kakashi wore the Hokage title for a while, then passed it on. Even Sasuke, his final student, had disappeared into self-imposed exile, wandering the world to atone for crimes not unlike Orochimaru's. And Naruto, the boy who had once been a loud, relentless force of opposition, now led the leaf as a symbol of unity. Orochimaru watched them all from the sidelines, not with bitterness, but with the fascination of someone watching seeds grow in soil they had once salted. He had been part of their past, but no longer part of their future. And that was fine. Kabuto remained a ghost in the background. His journey had diverged long ago. Redemption, penance, the healing of orphans, Kabuto's path was now one of rebuilding. Orochimaru did not interfere. Their bond, forged in shared obsession and broken in the fire of the Fourth War, had reached its natural end. They had been mirror and reflection, student and master. But time had made them strangers again. There was no hatred, no longing, just silence, and the occasional acknowledgement that they still existed, quietly, in different corners of the world. Orochimaru's final transformation was not a change in body, but in presence. He no longer demanded attention. He simply existed, like a lingering fog, like the memory of a shadow. He did not seek out allies. He did not nurture enemies. And perhaps that was the strangest part of all, that the man who had once torn through life in search of meaning now lived it gently, without needing to prove anything. He still had secrets, still had plans, but they were smaller, more personal. He observed life like a poet watches clouds, finding patterns, making meaning, but never needing to command the sky. He had, in the end, survived everything: loss, betrayal, hatred, war. And perhaps the cruelest and kindest irony was that survival had softened him, not sharpened him, not with regret, but with distance, like a knife dulled not from use, but from being set aside. And so he remained, not feared nor worshipped, just present, eternal, not because he had conquered death, but because he had stopped running from it. Time passed differently for Orochimaru than for others. For most people, the years moved forward like footsteps on a path, measurable, linear, and final. But for him, time had long since lost its straight lines. It stretched, curved, doubled back on itself. Some mornings, he woke and felt like he was still in the Third Shinobi War, the scent of smoke and blood fresh on his tongue. Other days, the world felt foreign, like he was an intruder in a future he had not planned to witness. He no longer tried to shape history. He simply observed it, wandering through it like a ghost still tethered to the world by a thread of unresolved curiosity. He continued his research not for control, but for understanding. His lab now bore no resemblance to the dark caverns or grotesque catacombs of his past. It was clean, minimal, quiet, a place of thought rather than torment. The test subjects were no longer unwilling prisoners or stolen vessels, but simulations, models, theoretical frameworks etched into scrolls and holograms. Even his assistants, once terrified or brainwashed, were now volunteers, young scientists and rogue shinobi who didn't fully trust him, but who recognized that his genius could peel back the curtain on things no one else dared to study. To them, he was not a hero or a villain, but a force of nature, something dangerous, but fascinating, like fear under glass. Yamato still monitored him. The quiet, stoic ANBU had long since stopped expecting betrayal, but he never stopped watching. Orochimaru didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed the consistency. Their strange rapport had become something like mutual respect, the kind that grows not from friendship, but from shared routine. Yamato would occasionally step into the lab, arms crossed, eyes scanning for signs of forbidden jutsu or hidden rituals. Orochimaru would greet him with a smirk, offer him tea, and return to his work. They rarely spoke of the past. They didn't need to. It lingered between them like a shared language neither of them wanted to use anymore. Still, the world outside changed. Villages rebuilt, Treaties were signed. New Kage rose and fell. The old generation slowly receded like the tide, their names becoming stories, their deeds folded into textbooks and bedtime tales. Orochimaru remained untouched by it all, a constant in a world that finally seemed to be moving on without him. He wasn't bitter. He found it beautiful, in a way, to see the world bloom in the absence of war. It reminded him of the childhood he never truly had, when the leaf was a place of laughter and light, before the shinobi system had shown him its fractures, before ambition had twisted his purpose. Sometimes he would walk the forest alone, not to hunt or to hide, but to think. He didn't fear assassins or old enemies. Those who had once sworn vengeance upon him had either died, retired, or forgotten their rage. The world had given up on punishing him, not out of forgiveness, but exhaustion. The name Orochimaru no longer summoned the same reaction. It was spoken now like folklore, half true, half feared, and half forgotten. And he, in turn, had let go of his desire to be remembered. In those quiet moments beneath the canopy of trees, he would sometimes think of Hiruzen, the third Hokage, his former teacher, the man who had both loved him and failed him. Orochimaru had once blamed him for everything, for not stopping him, for not understanding him, for not saving him. But with distance, that blame had dulled. He now saw Hiruzen not as an obstacle, but as a man who had tried and failed, just as Orochimaru had. They had both clung too tightly to their ideals. Both had watched their students fall. And both had, in the end, been wrong in ways they couldn't undo. There was no longer hatred in Orochimaru's memory of him, just a lingering sadness, like a song that ends too abruptly. Jiraiya haunted him more than Hiruzen, not because of what had happened, but because of what never did. They had been brothers in all but blood once, teammates, rivals, children chasing dreams too big for their small hands. Jiraiya had always walked a path bathed in sunlight, chasing hope even when it seemed foolish. Orochimaru had walked in the opposite direction, toward the shadows, convinced that truth lay where light could not reach. And yet, somewhere deep in his heart, Orochimaru had always wondered, what would have happened if he had followed Jiraiya instead? Not in battle, but in belief? What kind of man might he have become if he had trusted the world instead of trying to rewrite it? But Jiraiya was gone now, lost in the deep, taken by a student he had tried to save. Orochimaru had never visited the grave, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't believe it was the end. Jiraiya lived on in the teachings he passed to Naruto, in the legacy that echoed through the peace Naruto helped build. That was enough. Visiting the grave would have felt like trying to cage a spirit too wild to be buried. And then, of course, there was Tsunade, the final member of their old trio. Strong, brilliant, wounded by loss in ways only she understood. Orochimaru hadn't seen her in years, but he thought of her often. She, like him, had survived more than anyone should. But unlike him, she had chosen healing. She had stitched people back together, while he had once torn them apart. He didn't envy her, but he admired her. Tsunade had stood at the edge and pulled back. He had jumped. And now, standing so many years later, he finally understood the difference between courage and surrender. Orochimaru was no longer waiting for a grand revelation. He had made peace with the fact that some answers would never come, that some mysteries were not meant to be solved. He still studied, still experimented, but no longer out of desperation. Now, it was for the joy of it, the simple pleasure of learning, the thrill of asking a question no one else had dared to ask. He had not redeemed himself, not in the way stories demand. There was no public confession, no heroic sacrifice. He had not turned good. He had simply stopped being evil. And in that quiet in-between, he found something like freedom. Not the freedom to live forever or control others, but the freedom to exist as he was, unchained from ambition, unbound from fate. Years passed, and the world changed again. The leaf grew taller buildings. Shinobi moved through its streets in peace rather than urgency, and the academy filled with students who had never heard the sound of a battlefield. Orochimaru remained, a silent observer of this evolution, neither participant nor opponent. He watched children grow into shinobi without the weight of war dragging behind their footsteps. He listened to the laughter that echoed through the streets, unburdened, unafraid. This was the peace others had died to create. And for the first time, he began to wonder if he too had a place in it. Not as a leader, not as a legend, but simply as a man who had lived too long and learned too much to waste any more time chasing ghosts. The world no longer needed Orochimaru the Sannin. It didn't need the genius tyrant, the master of forbidden techniques, the snake in the grass. But maybe it could use something else. An archivist, perhaps. A quiet keeper of knowledge, of secrets too dangerous for the open world, but too important to forget. There were scrolls only he could read, jutsu only he had seen. Perhaps the future deserved access to them, but only when it was ready. Mitsuki became a mirror for him, not a clone, not a copy, but a reflection of everything Orochimaru had finally begun to understand. The boy was curious, yes, clever, gifted, like his creator, but he was also kind, unburdened by the bitterness that had poisoned Orochimaru's youth. Mitsuki didn't carry the hunger for power in his chest, only the quiet, brave desire to find his own path. And that, more than any jutsu or experiment, was the legacy Orochimaru had never intended to leave, but somehow had. He didn't try to control him. Orochimaru watched from afar as Mitsuki made friends, formed bonds, made mistakes. He let the boy stumble, let him rise, let him decide what kind of man he would become. That, perhaps, was the greatest act of growth Orochimaru had ever performed. Not in crafting Mitsuki's DNA, but in stepping back, in resisting the impulse to shape him completely, in trusting someone other than himself. There were times when people came to him for help. A strange request, but not unheard of. When the new generation faced threats born of old techniques, mutated versions of ancient curses, or forbidden summoning contracts. Some remembered the snake sage who once lived on the edge of madness. And Orochimaru answered, not eagerly, not with pride, but with precision. He would offer knowledge, never more than necessary. No lecture, no manipulation, just clarity. And when they left, they often did so with unease, unsure whether they had just been helped by a man or a monster. Orochimaru didn't mind. He wasn't trying to convince them of anything. Let history decide what he was. And then, one night, he returned to the Valley of the End. The statues still stood, cracked and weathered, silent witnesses to pain and reconciliation. The river still roared below, a reminder of the countless battles fought and forgotten. He stood at the edge, the same place where Naruto and Sasuke had nearly destroyed each other. He remembered watching from a distance, then not intervening, not yet understanding what it meant to sacrifice for someone else. Now, older, quieter, he watched the water and realized the current had always been moving forward, even when he tried to stop it, even when he tried to divert it. The valley had seen the worst of shinobi history, but it had also seen its rebirth. Orochimaru stayed there for a long time that night. Not meditating, not plotting, just being, listening, feeling. There was something almost human about the silence. When he returned home, the snakes greeted him in silence, coiled around ancient pillars, slithering across scrolls that hadn't been touched in decades. They no longer brought him messages or sacrifices. They simply coexisted with him now, less like servants, more like companions, creatures born of the earth, just like him, ageless, watchful, and tired of war. Kabuto came to visit once. Their last meeting had been strained, heavy with the weight of betrayal, identity, and 1,000 unsaid apologies. But time had softened even that wound. Kabuto had changed, grown gentle, introspective. He spoke not of vengeance or science, but of orphans, of caretaking, of redemption in small acts. Orochimaru listened, half smiling. He didn't try to recruit him, didn't correct him. He simply offered tea, and for a few hours, they sat in the quiet, two former villains, letting the years speak for them. Orochimaru had stopped searching for immortality, not because he feared death, but because he had finally begun to understand life. Not the grand, eternal kind he once sought, but the fleeting, ordinary kind. The kind found in simple conversations, in the sound of birds at dawn, in the rustle of leaves outside a hidden lair. He had chased eternity for so long that he had forgotten how precious a single day could be when it wasn't consumed by ambition. The boy he once was, the one who stared at the white snake with fascination and fear, was gone. In his place stood a man with white hair, golden eyes, and a soul stitched together with more regrets than victories. But still, he stood. Still, he woke each day and asked, "What can I learn now?" Not, "What can I conquer?" That shift, small as it was, changed everything. Orochimaru would never be celebrated. His face would never be carved into a mountain. His deeds never praised in the open. But deep in the forest, in a place where snakes slithered and silence ruled, a man once known as a monster had chosen to live, not as a god, not as a legend, but as something far more difficult, a person.